My husband's medical records showed a heart transplant he doesn't remember. The donor died in a case that was never solved. I found the records when I was looking for our insurance information to file a claim for my daughter's orthodontist appointment. The filing cabinet in our home office was organized by year, and I'd pulled the wrong folder by mistake. Instead of 2024 insurance documents, I was holding a thick medical file from 2019 with my husband Derek's name across the top. Inside were surgical reports, post-operative care instructions, and a transplant coordinator's notes detailing a complete heart transplant procedure performed at Memorial Hospital on March 15, 2019. The donor was listed as anonymous, but there was a case number and a notation that read, "Expedited allocation due to donor circumstances." My hands went numb as I read through page after page of documentation describing a surgery that had supposedly saved my husband's life. Except Derek had never mentioned having a heart transplant. He'd never been sick. He had no scar down the center of his chest. And in March 2019, he'd been on a business trip to Seattle that I remembered clearly because I'd been 7 months pregnant with our daughter Emma and had been annoyed about being left alone. I called Derek immediately. He was at work, managing the commercial real estate portfolio for a development company downtown. "Hey babe, what's up?" he answered, and I could hear the sounds of his office in the background, phones ringing and colleagues talking. I asked him directly if he'd ever had heart surgery, ever been hospitalized for a cardiac issue, ever received a transplant. There was a pause. Then he laughed. "What? No. Why would you ask that?" I explained about finding the medical records and he went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become cautious and strange. "Where did you find these records?" I told him they were in our filing cabinet, in a folder with his name on it, mixed in with our tax documents. He asked me to send photos of the pages and I did, watching the images upload while my heart pounded in my chest. 3 minutes later, he called back. "This is a mistake, some kind of administrative error. Those records aren't mine. My name, but not me. It happens sometimes with medical systems." But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I pointed out that the records included his date of birth, his social security number, his home address from 2019, which had been our apartment before we bought this house. Derek insisted it was identity theft or a filing error, something that could be easily explained. "I'll call the hospital and get this straightened out," he said. "Don't worry about it." But I was already worrying. I was staring at a surgical consent form with what appeared to be Derek's signature at the bottom, dated March 14, 2019, the day before the supposed transplant. The signature looked exactly right, the same way he looped his lowercase e and crossed his R. I asked him to come home early and he agreed, saying he'd leave within the hour. After we hung up, I kept reading through the file. There were preoperative test results showing severe cardiomyopathy, a condition where the heart muscle is too weak to pump blood effectively. According to the notes, Derek's ejection fraction had been measured at 18%, dangerously low and life-threatening. The cardiologist's assessment stated that without a transplant, the patient would likely die within 6 months. I tried to remember March 2019 in detail. I'd been heavily pregnant, working from home as a freelance graphic designer. Derek had been traveling frequently for work, which was normal for his job. I remembered him being tired when he came back from trips, but I'd attributed that to the demanding schedule and the stress of preparing for our first child. He'd never complained of chest pain or shortness of breath. He'd never collapsed or shown any signs of heart failure. In fact, I had clear memories of him helping me move furniture and set up the nursery that spring, physical work that someone with an 18% ejection fraction wouldn't have been capable of doing. The medical records also included post-transplant care instructions, medications he should have been taking daily, immunosuppressants to prevent his body from rejecting the donor heart. I went to our bathroom and checked the medicine cabinet. Derek took a daily multivitamin and occasionally used allergy medication. There were no prescription bottles, no anti-rejection drugs, nothing that suggested he was managing a transplanted organ. Derek arrived home 40 minutes later, walking through the door with his tie loosened and his expression tense. I'd spread all the medical records across our dining room table, and he stood there staring at them without touching anything. "I've never seen these before," he said quietly. "I don't know where they came from or how they got into our filing cabinet." I asked him the obvious question. If he'd never had a heart transplant, why did detailed surgical records with his personal information exist? He shook his head, running his hand through his dark hair in the gesture he used when he was frustrated or confused. "I don't know, but I know I've never had heart surgery. Look." He pulled off his shirt and stood there in our dining room, bare-chested, showing me his unmarked skin. There was no surgical scar, no sign that his chest had ever been opened. Heart transplant patients have a vertical scar down the center of their sternum where the chest is split open to access the heart. Derek's chest was smooth and unscarred except for a small mark on his left shoulder from a mountain biking accident in college. I wanted to believe him, but the evidence in front of me was too detailed and too specific to be a simple filing error. I picked up one of the documents, a transplant coordinator's note dated March 20, 2019, 5 days after the surgery. It described the patient's recovery as progressing normally, mentioned that he was tolerating the immunosuppressant medications well, and noted that he'd been asking when he could return to work. The note included observations about the patient's emotional state, describing him as anxious about the recovery timeline and eager to resume normal activities. It sounded exactly how Derek would react to a forced medical leave. He was always restless when he couldn't work, always pushing to get back to his normal routine faster than doctors recommended. Derek sat down at the table and started reading through the records himself, his face getting paler with each page. "This is insane," he muttered. "These notes describe me, my personality, my concerns. But I wasn't in a hospital in March 2019. I was in Seattle closing a deal for the Westlake property." I asked if he had proof of being in Seattle during that time, receipts or hotel records or photos. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through old emails and calendar entries. "Here," he said, showing me an email chain from March 14th, 2019, discussing meeting times and contract terms with a client in Seattle. The emails showed him actively working that day, the same day he'd supposedly signed surgical consent forms. He found more evidence: flight confirmation for a trip to Seattle on March 13th, hotel check-in at a downtown Marriott, expense reports for meals and transportation. According to his phone records and work documentation, he'd been in Seattle from March 13th through March 18th, completely overlapping with the dates when these medical records claimed he was in Memorial Hospital, undergoing and recovering from a heart transplant. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. Either the medical records were fabricated, or Derek's Seattle trip had never happened, and he'd been in a hospital instead. But his work had paid for that trip. His colleagues had been with him at some of the meetings. There were photos on his phone from Seattle, including one of him standing in front of Pike Place Market with a colleague named Troy. I suggested we call the hospital directly and demand an explanation. Derek agreed and dialed the number listed on the medical records for Memorial Hospital's transplant coordinator office. He was transferred 3 times before finally reaching someone who claimed to be able to access transplant records. Derek explained the situation, providing his name and date of birth, and asked for clarification about records indicating he'd received a heart transplant in March 2019. There was a long pause, then the coordinator came back on the line. "Sir, I'm showing that you were a transplant recipient. The surgery was performed by Dr. Lawrence Finch on March 15, 2019. You were discharged on March 21, 2019. Is there a specific question about your care?" Derek's face went white. "I never had a heart transplant. I've never been a patient at your hospital. There's been a mistake." The coordinator's voice became professional and careful. "Sir, I'm looking at extensive records here: preoperative workup, surgical notes, recovery documentation. If you believe there's been an error, you'll need to come in person to our medical records department with identification so we can investigate the discrepancy." Derek ended the call and sat there staring at nothing. "They have records. They're insisting I had the surgery." I asked the question that was making my skin crawl. "Is it possible you don't remember? Could something have happened that affected your memory?" He looked at me with something close to fear. "I remember March 2019. I remember the Seattle trip. I remember coming home and helping you paint the nursery. I remember every detail of that time period. I don't have gaps in my memory." But even as he said it, I saw doubt creeping into his expression. Human memory is fallible. People convince themselves of false memories all the time. Could his brain have constructed memories of a Seattle trip to replace the trauma of a life-threatening surgery? I suggested we go to the hospital immediately and resolve this in person. Derek nodded and grabbed his keys. We drove to Memorial Hospital in silence, both of us processing what this meant. If Derek had actually received a heart transplant and didn't remember it, something was catastrophically wrong with his health or his mind. If the records were fabricated, someone had gone to elaborate lengths to create a false medical history for him. The medical records department was on the 3rd floor of the hospital's administrative building. A woman named Gloria sat behind a desk and listened to our explanation with growing concern. Derek showed his driver's license and signed release forms authorizing the hospital to share his medical information. Gloria typed on her computer, frowned, typed more, then picked up her phone and made several calls. After 20 minutes, she asked us to wait while she consulted with the transplant department supervisor. We sat in the hallway on uncomfortable plastic chairs while hospital staff walked past us, everyone moving with purpose while we existed in this strange limbo of not knowing what was real. Gloria finally emerged with a younger man who introduced himself as Kenneth Wright, the assistant director of the transplant program. He invited us into a private office and closed the door. "Mr. Holloway, I've reviewed your file extensively. According to our records, you received a heart transplant on March 15, 2019, following a diagnosis of dilated cardiomyopathy. The surgery was successful and you recovered normally. You've been non-compliant with follow-up appointments, which is concerning, but the surgery itself is well documented." Derek leaned forward, his voice tight with frustration. "I never had surgery. I don't have a scar. I'm not taking any medications. How do you explain that?" Kenneth's expression shifted into something more cautious. "May I examine your chest?" Derek stood up and pulled off his shirt again, turning slowly so Kenneth could see his unmarked torso. Kenneth stared for a long moment, then asked Derek to sit down. "This is highly irregular. Transplant patients have clear scarring from the sternotomy. The absence of a scar is inconsistent with our surgical records." He pulled up something on his computer and turned the monitor so we could see. It showed a series of photos dated March 2019, showing a patient on an operating table with their chest open, a surgical team working around them. The patient's face was partially obscured by equipment, but but the body type matched Derek's build. Kenneth scrolled through more photos showing the actual transplant procedure, then post-operative images of the closed chest with fresh surgical staples creating a vertical line down the sternum. "These are photos from your surgery," Kenneth said carefully, "but you're correct that you don't have the expected scarring." I felt reality tilting sideways. Could those photos be of someone else? Kenneth shook his head. "The patient identification band is visible in several shots. It shows your husband's name and medical record number." He pulled up another screen showing the digital chart, pointing to entries made by nurses, surgeons, and other staff throughout the transplant process. The documentation was exhaustive and consistent, describing a routine transplant with normal recovery. Derek asked the obvious question. "If I had this surgery, where's my heart? The one that was removed? What happened to it?" Kenneth typed more commands and pulled up a pathology report. "Your diseased heart was sent to pathology for examination as is standard procedure. The report describes severe dilated cardiomyopathy consistent with the preoperative diagnosis. The tissue was disposed of according to medical waste protocols after examination." He looked between us with something that might have been fear. "I need to contact our chief of surgery. This situation requires immediate investigation. The absence of surgical scarring suggests either a documentation error of unprecedented scale or something else I can't explain." We waited for another hour while Kenneth made calls and consulted with other hospital administrators. Eventually, a security officer appeared and asked us to follow him to a different office. Inside, we met Dr. Lawrence Finch himself, the cardiac surgeon whose name appeared on all the transplant documentation. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confident presence that comes from decades of successful surgeries. He examined Derek's chest personally, his expression growing more troubled with each moment. "I performed hundreds of transplants in my career before retiring last year," he said slowly. "I remember cases with complications or unusual circumstances. I don't specifically remember your surgery, Mr. Holloway, which isn't surprising given the volume of patients I treated. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that if I performed an open heart transplant on you, you would have a significant scar. The absence of that scar is medically impossible." Derek's voice was shaking now. "So the records are fake? Someone created an elaborate false surgical history for me?" Dr. Finch shook his head. "I can't explain what I'm seeing. The documentation is too detailed and too consistent to be fabricated. Multiple staff members contributed to these notes over several days. The photographs show a real surgery, but the physical evidence contradicts the records completely." I asked about the donor, the person whose heart had supposedly been transplanted into Derek. Dr. Finch pulled up that information, though he explained that donor identities were normally protected. The donor was a 23-year-old male who died on March 14, 2019. Organ procurement occurred at County General Hospital following a traumatic incident. He paused, reading something on the screen. According to the notes, the donor's death was ruled suspicious and there was a police investigation, but organs were still cleared for donation after medical examination. He looked up at us. The donor's name was listed internally as Julian Voss. Does that name mean anything to either of you? Derek and I both shook our heads. We'd never heard that name before. Dr. Finch made a note and said he'd be contacting the police department to discuss the case. If there's been some kind of fraud or identity confusion, law enforcement needs to be involved. I'm also ordering a complete cardiac workup for you, Mr. Holloway. We need to know if you have your original heart or a transplanted one, regardless of what the records claim. Derek was admitted to the hospital's cardiac unit that evening for testing. They ran an echocardiogram, an EKG, blood tests, and a cardiac MRI. I sat in his room while technicians came and went, both of us silent and shell-shocked. The results came back the next morning and Dr. Finch delivered them personally. Your heart function is completely normal. Ejection fraction is 58%, which is excellent. More importantly, cardiac MRI shows no evidence of transplant surgery. The heart tissue characteristics are consistent with your native heart, not a donor organ. Additionally, blood tests show no immunosuppressant drugs in your system, and antibody panels show no evidence that your body has ever been exposed to foreign tissue. He sat down heavily in the chair next to Derek's bed. Mr. Holloway, you have not received a heart transplant. That much is medically certain, but I cannot explain why we have extensive documentation claiming that you did. Derek asked the question I was too afraid to voice. If I didn't get the transplant, who did? Someone received Julian Voss's heart. If it wasn't me, who was it? Dr. Finch said he'd be working with hospital administration to investigate, but suggested we also file a police report about the fraudulent medical records. We left the hospital the next morning with more questions than we'd arrived with. Derek was physically healthy, which should have been a relief, but instead we were left with the disturbing reality that someone had created an elaborate false surgical history in his name, complete with photographs and multi-day documentation from dozens of hospital staff. At home, Derek pulled out his records from March 2019 again, laying them next to the medical documents. The email chains from Seattle were real. His credit card showed charges from Seattle restaurants and the hotel. His colleague Troy confirmed in a text that they'd definitely been together in Seattle that week, even sending a photo of both of them at a client dinner on March 15th, the exact day Derek was supposedly in surgery. The two realities couldn't coexist, but they both appeared to be true. I started researching Julian Voss, the supposed donor. A search of his name combined with the date revealed a news article from March 2019. Man found dead in suspicious circumstances. Investigation ongoing. Julian Voss, 23, had been found dead in his apartment. The article was vague about the cause of death, noting only that police were investigating and that the death appeared suspicious. I found more articles from the following months. The investigation into Julian's death had stalled with no arrests made. His family had given statements describing him as a healthy young man with no known enemies. There were calls for justice that eventually faded as the case went cold. The most recent article I could find was from June 2020, over a year after his death, mentioning that the case remained unsolved. I showed Derek what I'd found and he stared at Julian's photo in the news article. He was young, dark-haired, with an easy smile in the picture that appeared to be from a family gathering. "I've never seen him before," Derek said. "I don't know who he is or why his death would be connected to fake medical records in my name." I suggested we contact the police department that had investigated Julian's death. Derek agreed, and we called the non-emergency number, explaining that we had information potentially related to an unsolved case from 2019. We were transferred to Detective Angela Chen, who'd been the lead investigator on Julian's death. We explained our situation, and she asked us to come to the station immediately. Detective Chen was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many cases go unsolved. She listened to our explanation, examined copies of the medical records we'd brought, and pulled up Julian Voss's case file on her computer. "Julian's death was suspicious from the start," she said. "He was found in his apartment by his roommate. Initial examination suggested possible drug overdose, but toxicology came back clean. Further investigation revealed signs of foul play, bruising consistent with a struggle, evidence that his apartment had been searched. But we never found a clear cause of death or any suspects." She looked at Derek carefully. "You're saying these medical records claim you received Julian's heart, but you never had surgery?" Derek confirmed that was correct, showing her the hospital's own admission that he had no transplant scar and normal heart function. Detective Chen leaned back in her chair, thinking. "If you didn't receive the transplant, someone else did using your identity. That suggests sophisticated medical fraud. The question is why? Why use your identity specifically?" Derek had been asking himself that question since we'd found the records. He ran through the possibilities out loud. Identity theft for financial gain, but his insurance hadn't been billed for the surgery according to the documents we'd reviewed. Someone who needed to hide their own identity receiving a donor organ. A clerical error that snowballed into elaborate false documentation. None of the explanations felt adequate. Detective Chen made notes and said she'd be reopening aspects of Julian's case in light of this new information. If someone went to these lengths to obscure who actually received his heart, that suggests Julian's death and the transplant are connected. Someone wanted to hide the real recipient's identity. She asked if she could take the medical records as evidence, and we agreed. Before we left, she pulled up a photo on her computer. "This is Julian's roommate, the man who found him. His name is Philip Crawford. After Julian died, Philip moved away. We lost contact with him and he stopped responding to our follow-up questions. Do you recognize him?" The photo showed a man in his 20s with light brown hair and nervous eyes. Derek stared at the image for a long moment, his expression changing. "He looks familiar. I don't know from where, but I've seen him before." That night, Derek couldn't sleep. I found him at 2 a.m. sitting in our home office, searching through his old photos and work files. "I know I've seen Philip Crawford before," he said. "It's driving me crazy that I can't place where." I sat with him, helping him scroll through thousands of images from 2019. We found photos from work events, client meetings, social gatherings with friends. In a folder labeled Seattle March 2019, there were dozens of photos from Derek's business trip. We looked through them methodically. Pictures of the hotel, the office building where they'd met with clients, team dinners, tourist shots from Pike Place Market. Then Derek stopped on one image, his finger hovering over the screen. There. The photo showed Derek and his colleague Troy standing outside a restaurant at night. In the background, barely visible among the blurred crowd of pedestrians, was someone who looked strikingly similar to Philip Crawford. Derek zoomed in on the image, trying to enhance the blurry figure. "I remember this night, March 15th. We'd just finished dinner and Troy took this photo. I remember someone bumping into me right after the photo was taken, apologizing profusely. I didn't get a good look at his face." The date clicked into place. March 15th, the day Derek was supposedly in surgery. If Philip Crawford had been in Seattle that night and had deliberately bumped into Derek, that suggested this wasn't coincidence. I asked Derek what happened after the collision, and he thought hard. The guy apologized and hurried away. I didn't think anything of it at the time. People bump into each other on crowded sidewalks. But now that I'm thinking about it, there was something odd. After he bumped into me, I felt strange for the rest of the night, dizzy and disoriented. I thought maybe I'd had too much wine at dinner. The implication was horrifying. If Philip Crawford had drugged Derek somehow during that interaction, it would explain the disorientation. But why? Derek pulled out his work calendar from that period and traced through the following days. March 16th through March 18th, he'd been scheduled for meetings in Seattle. But looking at his email activity, there was a notable gap. From the evening of March 15th through the morning of March 19th, he'd sent no emails, made no calls, had no documented work activity. I thought I was working those days, Derek said slowly, but I don't have any actual memories of specific meetings or conversations. It's all vague. I felt cold understanding washing over me. You were in the hospital. You were the one who received Julian's heart. The Seattle trip was a cover story implanted in your memory somehow. Derek shook his head violently. That's impossible. I don't have a transplant scar. The MRI showed I have my original heart. But even as he argued, I saw the fear in his eyes. The fear that maybe he didn't know his own history as well as he thought. The next morning, we returned to Detective Chen with the photo and our theory. She examined the image carefully, confirming the background figure did resemble Philip Crawford. If Philip drugged you and you were actually hospitalized during those days, your work records and hotel stay would have been fabricated, she said. But that would require multiple people to be involved in the deception. Your colleague Troy, the hotel staff, the airline, that's a massive conspiracy. Derek pointed out that he'd been traveling alone for most of the trip. Troy had met him in Seattle but hadn't been at the hotel. The meetings had been small, just Derek and the clients. If my memory of those days is false, if I was actually unconscious or recovering from surgery, it wouldn't have been hard to create the appearance that I was working. Someone could have sent emails from my account. My hotel room could have been charged but never occupied. Detective Chen made several phone calls, speaking to people in hushed tones. When she finished, her expression was grim. I contacted the Seattle hotel. They have no record of you checking in, despite the reservation existing. I also spoke to the client you supposedly met with on March 16th. They have no record of a meeting that day and say they didn't see you until the March 19th meeting, which they specifically remember because you seemed unwell and distracted. Derek's face went pale. So I wasn't in Seattle. I was here, in the hospital. Detective Chen nodded slowly. It appears so. But that brings us back to the impossible problem. If you had a heart transplant, where's your scar? Why does medical imaging show your native heart? How are you alive without anti-rejection medications? She pulled out her phone and made another call. I'm bringing in a specialist, someone who knows about covert medical procedures and identity manipulation. This is beyond standard police investigation. The specialist arrived 2 hours later. Her name was Dr. Helena Price, and she introduced herself as a consultant for cases involving medical fraud and illegal organ trafficking. She reviewed all our documentation with intense focus, asking detailed questions about Derek's memories, his health, and the timeline of events. I've seen cases of identity switching in transplant records, Dr. Price said finally. Usually it involves wealthy individuals who need organs but don't want to wait on the official list. They pay for someone else to receive the transplant in their name, then the records are altered post-surgery to obscure the truth. She looked at Derek carefully. The fact that you have no scar despite extensive photographic documentation of surgery suggests the photos aren't of you. Someone else received Julian Voss's heart using your identity, then you were made to believe you'd been in Seattle while that surgery happened. Derek's voice was strained. But why me? Why use my identity? Dr. Price had a theory. You were traveling alone, staying in a city where you weren't well known. Your work involved client meetings that could be rescheduled or fabricated. You were the perfect candidate for identity theft because you had legitimate reasons to be away from home and minimal oversight of your daily activities. She suggested Derek might have been drugged by Philip Crawford not just to incapacitate him, but to make him suggestible to false memories. There are pharmaceutical techniques for memory manipulation. If you were given the right combination of drugs, you could have been made to believe you experienced events that never happened. The implications were staggering. Someone had stolen Derek's identity to receive a heart transplant, had drugged and manipulated him to create false memories, and had gone to extraordinary lengths to maintain the deception. But who was the actual recipient, and why had they needed to hide their identity so desperately? Detective Chen had another theory. What if the person who received the heart was involved in Julian's death? What if they killed him to get his heart? The room went silent. It was a monstrous idea, but it made horrible sense. If someone had murdered Julian specifically to harvest his organs, they would need to hide their identity to avoid connecting themselves to the crime. Dr. Price nodded slowly. Organ trafficking cases sometimes involve murder. Desperate patients with means have been known to arrange for donors to be killed. If that's what happened here, using Derek's identity would create perfect cover. The official recipient has an alibi, and if anyone investigated, they'd find Derek alive and healthy, making the whole thing seem like a clerical error. Derek asked the obvious question. How do we find who actually received the heart? Detective Chen said they'd need to get a court order to access the hospital's records more thoroughly, looking for any patient admitted during the same time period who might have been the real recipient. She'd also be investigating Philip Crawford more aggressively, trying to locate him and bring him in for questioning. Dr. Price offered to work with the hospital to review surgical schedules, anesthesia records, and OR assignments. Someone on staff would have known about the identity switch. We need to find that person. Over the following week, the investigation expanded rapidly. Court orders were issued, hospital staff were interviewed, financial records were subpoenaed. What emerged was a picture of systematic corruption, A nurse named Valerie Hunt had falsified admission records, creating a digital trail showing Derek as a patient, while the real recipient was admitted under a false name. An anesthesiologist named Dr. Ronald Beck had administered the surgery, drugs, and post-operative care without properly documenting the real patient's identity. Both Valerie and Dr. Beck had received substantial payments in March 2019, deposits that they'd explained as inheritance money, but which now appeared suspicious. When confronted, Valerie broke first. She admitted that she'd been approached by someone who called himself a medical coordinator for a private patient who needed emergency cardiac transplant but wanted privacy. She'd been offered $50,000 to facilitate the identity switch and maintain false records. She claimed she didn't know the real recipient's identity and had never met him personally, only dealing with the coordinator through encrypted messages. Dr. Beck told a similar story. He'd been paid $75,000 to perform the anesthesia and post-operative care for a patient whose identity was being protected. He'd been told it was a foreign dignitary who needed medical care in the United States but wanted to avoid publicity. Both of them identified photos of Philip Crawford as the coordinator who'd arranged everything. With this information, Detective Chen got a warrant for Philip's arrest. But locating him proved difficult. He'd moved frequently since Julian's death, staying off the grid and using cash for most transactions. Finally, they tracked him to a small apartment in Oregon through a utility bill. Local police picked him up and transported him back for questioning. In the interrogation room, Philip was nervous and defensive. He denied knowing anything about medical fraud or identity theft. But when Detective Chen showed him the evidence they'd compiled, his resistance crumbled. "I didn't want to be part of this," he said, his voice shaking. "But they threatened me. They said if I didn't help, they'd kill me too." He explained that Julian had been murdered by someone who needed a heart transplant urgently. Julian had been healthy, young, and a compatible match. Philip had been forced to make the death look accidental, to call 911 at the right time, to ensure Julian's organs would be viable for donation. The person who needed the heart was powerful. They had connections everywhere. Doctors, hospital administrators, police officers. I was just a college student. I couldn't fight them. Detective Chen pressed him on the recipient's identity. Philip hesitated, then said a name. "Donald Ashford." The name meant nothing to me, but Detective Chen's expression changed immediately. "The state senator?" Philip nodded miserably. "He was dying. He needed a heart immediately but wasn't high enough on the transplant list. He paid people to find a compatible donor and arranged the whole thing." The revelation was explosive. Donald Ashford was a prominent politician with presidential ambitions. If he'd orchestrated a murder to obtain an organ transplant, it would destroy his career and his freedom. But proving it would be difficult. Philip's testimony alone might not be enough, especially against someone with Ashford's resources and connections. Dr. Price suggested they examine Ashford's medical records to confirm he'd received a transplant. But getting access to a sitting senator's private health information would require significant legal maneuvering. Detective Chen worked with the district attorney's office to build a case. With Philip's testimony, the hospital staff confessions, and the evidence of financial payments, they had enough for a warrant. FBI agents raided Ashford's office and home simultaneously, seizing documents and electronic devices. Ashford's lawyers immediately fought back, claiming harassment and political persecution. But the evidence kept mounting. Financial records showed Ashford had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to a medical consulting firm that didn't actually provide any legitimate services. Phone records connected him to phone calls with Philip Crawford and the corrupt hospital staff. Most damning, Ashford's personal physician, when questioned under oath, admitted that Ashford had received a heart transplant in March 2019 and had been taking immunosuppressant medications ever since. The physician claimed ignorance about how the transplant had been arranged, but his testimony confirmed that Ashford was indeed the recipient of Julian Voss's heart. Derek and I watched the news coverage as the scandal unfolded. Senator Ashford held a press conference denying all allegations, claiming he'd received a legitimate transplant through proper channels. But as more evidence emerged, his story fell apart. Julian's family gave tearful interviews describing how their son had been murdered for his organs. Philip detailed how he'd been coerced into helping fake Julian's death as accidental. The corrupt hospital staff described the elaborate scheme to use Derek's identity as cover. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Calls for Ashford's resignation and prosecution came from all sides. Within a week, criminal charges were filed: conspiracy to commit murder, organ trafficking, fraud, identity theft, and corruption. Ashford was arrested at his home, the images of him in handcuffs broadcast nationally. The trial took place 8 months later. Derek and I attended every day, sitting with Julian's family in the courtroom. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Ashford's guilt. Philip testified about being forced to help murder Julian. The hospital staff detailed the identity switch scheme. Financial experts traced money from Ashford's accounts to all the participants. Most dramatically, medical experts testified that Ashford's transplanted heart had genetic markers matching Julian Voss, proving definitively that he'd received the murdered man's organ. Ashford's defense argued that he'd been deceived by his medical coordinators, that he'd believed he was receiving a legitimately donated organ. But the evidence of his direct involvement in planning and financing the scheme was too strong. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Ashford was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The corrupt hospital staff received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Philip Crawford, who'd cooperated fully with investigators, received a reduced sentence of 10 years. Julian's family told reporters they finally had justice for their son, though nothing could bring him back. Derek struggled with the aftermath of learning that his identity had been stolen for such a horrific purpose. He underwent therapy to process the memory manipulation and the violation of being used as an unwitting participant in murder. Dr. Price explained that the drugs used on him had created false memories that felt completely real, and that distinguishing between actual and implanted memories might never be fully possible. But the core truth was clear. Derek had been in the hospital during those March days in 2019, drugged and unconscious while his identity was being used. The Seattle trip existed only in his manipulated recollection. The hospital issued a formal apology and overhauled their identity verification procedures. The state medical board investigated how such a scheme had been possible and implemented new safeguards. But the damage to institutional trust was done. People questioned how a senator could arrange a murder and illegal transplant with the cooperation of hospital staff and medical professionals. The corruption had reached deep into systems that were supposed to protect people. Julian's family established a foundation in his name to prevent organ trafficking and support investigation into suspicious donor deaths. Derek and I contributed substantially to the foundation and remained in touch with Julian's parents. His mother told us that knowing the truth, however painful, was better than the uncertainty they'd lived with. For Derek and me, the revelation forced us to question everything we thought we knew about security and identity. If Derek's memories could be manipulated and his identity stolen for months without him realizing, what else might be vulnerable? We increased our security measures, regularly checked our medical and financial records, and became advocates for stronger protections against identity theft. Emma, our daughter, grew up knowing the story of how her father had been used in a criminal conspiracy. We told her age-appropriate versions as she got older, emphasizing the importance of fighting corruption and seeking truth. She became passionate about criminal justice reform, inspired by the idea that ordinary people could help expose powerful criminals. 5 years after the initial discovery, Derek received a letter from Donald Ashford in prison. In it, Ashford apologized for the harm he'd caused, but maintained he'd been acting out of desperation to survive. He described the terror of dying, of knowing his heart was failing, of watching the transplant list tick by too slowly. He claimed he'd never intended for anyone to die, that the murder had been arranged by his coordinators without his explicit knowledge. Derek read the letter once and threw it away. Whether Ashford had directly ordered Julian's murder or just created the conditions that made it inevitable, the result was the same. A young man had died so a powerful politician could live, and dozens of people had been complicit in covering it up. The only reason the truth emerged was because Derek had accidentally found medical records that should have been destroyed. One filing mistake had unraveled an entire conspiracy. The case became a cautionary tale in medical ethics courses and law enforcement training. It demonstrated how institutional corruption could facilitate murder, how identity could be weaponized, and how the wealthy could manipulate systems designed to be fair. But it also showed that truth could emerge from unexpected places, and that ordinary citizens could help expose extraordinary crimes. Julian Voss's heart continued beating in Donald Ashford's chest, keeping alive the man who'd arranged for its original owner to die. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ashford would spend the rest of his life in prison, sustained by an organ stolen through murder, a living reminder of his crimes. Derek eventually made peace with not fully knowing which memories from March 2019 were real and which were manufactured. He had his life, his family, and his future. Julian Voss had none of those things, murdered at 23 for the crime of being young and healthy with a compatible heart. Derek wore a bracelet with Julian's name on it, a daily reminder of the man whose death had intersected with his life in such a horrific way. Justice had been served, the criminals were imprisoned, the corruption exposed. But Julian was still gone, his family still grieving, their lives permanently altered by one powerful man's desperate selfishness. That was the truth Derek carried forward, that justice, when it finally came, could never fully repair what had been destroyed. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.